Today's video we're going to introduce ions, and we're also going to continue calculations to determine the number of protons, neutrons, and electrons in a given atom. We're going to start by just defining what an ion is. An ion is an atom in which the total number of electrons is not equal to the total number of protons. This gives the atom an overall positive or negative charge. Remember, atoms are neutral. They have the same number of positive protons as they have negative electrons. So all the positives cancel with the negatives. When an atom gains or loses electrons, the number becomes unequal and therefore creates a charge. We know something is an ion because we indicate that with a superscript in the top right as follows. Go ahead and label the symbol. This is Na for sodium, O stands for oxygen, and B stands for boron. And the numbers and plus or negative signs at the top are the charges. This indicates sodium with a plus charge is sodium 1 positive. Oxygen with a 2 negative charge. And boron with a 3 positive charge. Notice that the charge is written, the number is before the sign. And also we tend to leave out the 1 if it is a 1 positive or a 1 negative ion. A few additional pieces of information. Each element tends to form very specific ions. You'll learn more about that in the next unit about the periodic table. Also, all the ions of a given element have essentially the same properties, many of the same physical and chemical properties. And molecules or groups of atoms can also form ions. You'll learn more about that if you go on to take chemistry. I wanted to throw in this slide because several students ask, why do I need to know this? What does this have to do with life? This slide just shows a few of the ions that happen to help our health or harm our health if we have too much or not enough of them. Some that you may be familiar with are the first 3 particularly. Sodium. This helps the body regulate fluids. So if you have too much sodium, you tend to get swollen. And potassium, you may have heard that if you have muscle cramps, you need more potassium. And calcium, you probably remember being told when you were young that if you drink plenty of milk, the calcium in it will help you build strong bones. So there are reasons why you need to learn about ions, and a lot of it has to do with biology and health. Back to calculating and understanding what an ion is. When an atom loses electrons, so it gives away negative particles, it actually becomes positively charged because there end up being more positive protons than negative electrons. Remember, the number of protons does not change. We call these positively charged ions cations. C-A-T-I-O-N-S. Notice that the last part of the word is ion. Circle that, highlight it. It's one of your vocabulary terms. It's also good to know that cations usually form from metal atoms. So gold, silver, zinc, these tend to form positive cations. And one way I help myself to remember that cation means positive is to think of this guy right here. This is Peter Criss. He is in the metal band Kiss, and he dresses and goes by the name Catman. So cations remind me of Catman, who is in a metal group and that's pretty positive to me. I know. So what happens is a sodium atom, for example, will lose one of its valence electrons and it will form a sodium ion, the sodium 1 positive that we saw a few slides ago, and it has a charge of 1 positive. So we start with 11 protons and 11 electrons, 11 positives, 11 negatives. When it loses an electron, it still has the same 11 protons, positives, but now it only has 10 negatives. So if we have 10 positives and 11 negatives, we end up with a 1 positive charge. The same thing happens with magnesium, but the magnesium tends to lose 2 valence electrons and forms a magnesium ion with a charge of 2 positive. We have 12 positive protons and 12 negative electrons. If it loses these 2 electrons, they go away, they get excited, they leave and maybe go join another atom. We still have our 12 positives because the number of protons will not change, but now we're left with only 10 negatives. So when we do that math, we have 2 more positives than we have negatives. Negative ions form the opposite way. If an atom gains electrons, so taking in more negatives, it will become negatively charged because there are now more negative electrons than there were positive protons to begin with. These negatively charged ions are called anions. Again, the word ion is still in there. If you remember from stems, an, the prefix an means not. So not is negative. This is a vocab word, so make sure you highlight, circle, star, make sure that word stands out. And these usually form from non-metal atoms. So oxygen, sulfur, chlorine. And one way that I remember this is onions. Anion looks like the word onion. It's 1 letter away. And I hate onions, so they're negative to me. So anions, onions, negative. If that doesn't work for you, figure out some way to help yourself remember the difference between positive cations and negative anions. Chlorine atoms, a nonmetal, have 7 valence electrons, and they like to gain 1 so that they will form an octet. This octet is something that you will learn about again when we get to the periodic table unit. Because the chlorine atom has gained an extra electron, this guy is now joining. He came from somewhere else, now he wants to join the party. We started with 17 positives and 17 negatives because neutral atoms have the same number. After we've gained the electrons, the number of protons stays the same, so we still have 17 positives, but now we have 18 negatives. So if we do the math here, 17 minus 18 gives us negative 1. So a chlorine atom tends to take a negative 1 charge. Notice, this is now called a chloride ion. Any of the anions change the ending of their name to "ide." Chloride, oxide, bromide, etc. So let's have a learning check. Does aluminum, symbol Al, form a cation or an anion? What is the charge of the aluminum ion if it loses 3 electrons? And what is the symbol for the aluminum ion? Pause the video here and find those answers. When you're done finding the answers for yourself, continue and we'll go over them. So aluminum is a metal. We know that because it's shiny and silver. So it will form a positive cation. What will be the charge if it loses 3 electrons? If it started with a certain number of electrons and it got 3 more negatives, then its charge, it loses 3 negatives, I'm sorry. If it loses 3 negatives, then it actually has 3 more positives than negative charges. So it will end up with a positive 3 charge. And the symbol then would be the symbol Al with the 3 positive charge in the top right corner. Another learning check for each of the ions listed. Identify the total number of electrons for each. Pause the video. Find each on the periodic table to find the number of protons, and then you can calculate the number of electrons. Cobalt, 3 negative. When you find cobalt, it's number 27 on the periodic table, so it has 27 protons. Subtract the negative 3, and you end up with 30 electrons. So it has 30 electrons, negatives, which is 3 more than the 27 positives. Lithium is number 3 on the periodic table, which means its atomic number is 3. It has 3 protons. The charge is +1. That means it has 1 more positive than it has negatives. So it must only have 2 more negatives left in the atom. Chromium, 3 positive. Chromium is number 24, so that's how many protons it has. The +3 charge, if we subtract the positive 3, we end up with 21 electrons. There are 3 more positives than there are negatives. Rubidium, 1 negative. Rubidium is number 37 on the periodic table, so there are 37 protons. Subtract the -1, which means we have 1 extra electron, giving 37 protons plus 1 electron is 38 electrons. This works because the number of protons does not change, but the number of electrons can. If the atom gains electrons, it becomes more negative, such as the cobalt and the rubidium. If it loses electrons, it becomes more positive, like the lithium and the chromium. So the rule is, subtract the charge from the atomic number. In other words, the atomic number minus the charge equals the number of neutrons. In order to keep this video from running too long, we are going to save the calculation chart again for the demonstration video on how to calculate the number of protons, neutrons, and electrons. In the meantime, take a look at this chart and see if you can find the answers before I go over them with you.